Now, in section 4 of chapter 21, we need to look at a couple of other gas laws that help us to understand gas exchange, both in the lungs, pulmonary gas exchange, and in the tissues. And so one of those gas laws is called Dalton's Law. Let me just read out the definition for you. Total pressure, Dalton's Law is the total pressure, says is the sum of the individual pressures of each gas. So each gas that you have in a mixture is going to have its own individual pressure. And it also says that the pressure of that gas is proportional to the percentage of the total. So for example, if you think about the air you're breathing in the atmosphere, you may not realize it, but about 78% of what you're breathing is actually nitrogen gas. You're breathing a mixture of gases. It's not all oxygen. And so about 78% is nitrogen, maybe 20, 21, perhaps 22%, depending on where you're located, maybe oxygen. Then you have a few other gases. CO2, there's actually very little CO2 that you're actually breathing in the mixture of gases. It's less than 1%. And you have a few other inert type gases like argon and things. But what that says is in a mixture of gases, each gas has its own individual pressure, and that gives you a proportion of the total. And so, for example, the example that I have here, if you know that the pressure of the gases in the atmosphere is 760 millimeters of mercury, that's one atmospheric pressure. That would be like the pressure at sea level. And you know that you can measure this. If you knew that 21% of that mixture is actually oxygen, then if you multiply those two, 21% times 760, you could figure out that the partial pressure, the pressure of oxygen in that mixture of gases, is actually 160 millimeters of mercury. Now, one other gas law that comes into play here when we're talking about diffusion of gases and breathing and moving gases in and out of the lungs and out of the tissues is something called Henry's Law. Henry's Law is stated there for you. The concentration of a dissolved gas, how much gas you have dissolved in a liquid, is a function of two things. It's a function of the pressure of that gas and what's called the solubility coefficient. It turns out that you can dissolve gases in a liquid, right? So if everybody's had some kind of carbonated drink, all that is carbon dioxide dissolved in a liquid. We can dissolve different gases. You can dissolve oxygen, carbon dioxide, you can dissolve gases in liquids, but each one has its own chemical properties. Each one has its own solubility coefficient, how easy it is to dissolve a particular gas in a liquid. And it turns out, you don't need to know the numbers here, but it turns out that it's a lot easier to dissolve carbon dioxide, about 20 times easier. The coefficient here is listed for you, about 0.57. It's a lot easier, 20 times easier to dissolve CO2 in a liquid than it is oxygen. Oxygen doesn't dissolve that well in a liquid. Now, there's several factors that affect pulmonary gas exchange. This is gas exchange taking place in the lungs. We looked at, the respiratory membrane. This is gas exchange taking place inside of the air sacs, the alveolar air sacs, across the respiratory membrane. And there's three main factors that affect that. First of all, there's surface area. Now, they estimate inside of a lung, inside of two lungs, you would have approximately 80 square meters worth of surface area. That's quite a bit of space. You can think of a room that's about 25 by 30 feet room size is how much area you would have inside of your air sacs if you could add it all up. And so as long as you have plenty of surface area, you have plenty of room for gas exchange. But anything that decreases the surface area, such as emphysema, or cancer or pulmonary fibrosis or some other disorder that affects the surface area, that's going to reduce your amount of pulmonary gas exchange. You may be ventilating fine, you may be breathing in and out, but you also have to remember those 4 different parts of respiration we looked at in the very first part of the first video. You've got to be able to ventilate, but you also have to go through pulmonary gas exchange to complete the process of respiration. How thick the respiratory membrane is, that's another key factor in determining how efficient your pulmonary gas exchange is. And of course, as you can imagine, the thicker that respiratory membrane, you can see the little picture of it here. Again, this would be the respiratory membrane. Inside is the air sac. You take in a deep breath. Here's the oxygen. It's got to diffuse across that 6 layers of membrane. If something causes that to be thicker, then you're not diffusing the gas across the membrane as easily. So for example, maybe you have pneumonia and you have inflammation in some of your lung tissue, or you have fluid, some kind of edema, swelling around the lungs, and that's causing the membrane membrane to be thickness, or you have some scarring tissue in the lungs. Whatever the case is, the thicker that respiratory membrane, then the harder it is to go through pulmonary gas exchange. Then the third thing that affects pulmonary gas exchange is something called ventilation perfusion matching. Ventilation is, again, breathing in and out, getting the oxygen carbon dioxide exchange. Perfusion, remember, is blood flow. And so in the little diagram here, you see they've just shown you one air sac to kind of think about, but you would have millions of these, but here they show you one air sac, one alveolus, and the capillaries that line that air sac. The capillaries represent the perfusion part of this, and the air sac is going to represent ventilation. And so what your body tries to do is to match, to get the most efficient gas exchange possible. They try to match the ventilation with the amount of perfusion that you have. So take a look at the diagrams here. Diagram A. So for example, if you think of maybe there's some kind of obstruction in the air sac that you're not getting the best ventilation in a particular air sac. If that's the case, if you don't have enough ventilation in this particular air sac, then you don't need to have as much blood flow or perfusion coming to this air sac, because that's kind of a waste of efficiency. So to better make use of your resources, if you have an air sac that has plenty of oxygen coming into it, that's where you want to dilate your capillaries here to increase the perfusion there. So now you have you try to maximize the amount of gas exchange there. Then in part B, let's say, for example, you don't have a lot of perfusion coming to a particular air sac for whatever reason. Maybe there's decreased blood flow to this area for whatever reason. So that means decreased blood flow coming in. There's no reason to waste the resources of the ventilation in this particular air sac. It will be better to inflate, and send more air to other air sacs, like the one on the right, that has more perfusion. You try to match the amount of ventilation with perfusion to maximize your efficiency. Tissue gas exchange, well, this is very similar, except you're talking about gas exchange out in the tissues. And so things like surface area, again, that's going to determine, how big is your capillary bed, how many capillaries do you have in an area. That's your surface area. How far you have to diffuse the gases in between, the tissues and the capillaries. That's another factor here. And then perfusion of the tissue, how much blood flow out that you have, how much blood flow, how much oxygen that you have going through and being transported in the blood. There are individuals that are anemic. They have problems transporting gases, transporting oxygen. Maybe they have a low iron level, or whatever the problem is, maybe low red blood cell count, low hemoglobin count. These types of things would affect the perfusion. Which leads us to how we are transporting gases. And so according to some of the data we've seen, hemoglobin to transport oxygen is the most efficient way to transport gases or transport oxygen in the body. And so hemoglobin binds directly to oxygen, and about 98.5% of the oxygen that's transported in the body is actually bound to the hemoglobin molecule. And remember, hemoglobin has four main chains associated with it. Each chain has a heme group. That's where the iron is there, and the iron helps to attract the oxygen molecule. Although a small amount, about 1.5%, is what your textbook talks about, is actually dissolved in the plasma. So not as much dissolved in the plasma. And remember, according to Henry's law, it's kind of hard or difficult to dissolve oxygen in a fluid, in a gas, in a liquid. And so, by far most of the oxygen is transported bound to the hemoglobin. Now, there's 5 factors we need to talk about that help to influence this type of binding of oxygen to hemoglobin. Now, the oxygen, one thing to kind of think about is oxygen needs to bind to the hemoglobin, but it also needs to be released once it gets to the tissues. So again, kind of think about a scenario. You take a deep breath, you go through pulmonary exchange, you get the oxygen into the bloodstream, into the capillaries there in the lungs. The oxygen is connected to the hemoglobin, but now you need to transport it through the blood, go out to the tissues, and now you need the oxygen to be released from the hemoglobin so that it can go and diffuse out into the tissues. And so these 5 factors help in the process to determine whether or not oxygen is going to be bound to the hemoglobin or is it going to be released out into the tissue. So let's go over each of these individually. Number 1 is a partial pressure of oxygen, right? The basic idea here is that the more pressure that you have of oxygen, the higher amount of oxygen you have, the more it's going to bind to the hemoglobin. And so if you think about it, where would you have the most amount of oxygen? And of course, that's inside of your lungs. And so the graph up here says, inside, when you take a deep breath, you basically saturate. The idea is you would saturate your hemoglobin molecule and fill it up with oxygen. Each hemoglobin can hold 4 molecules of oxygen, and so that would take place in the air sacs. And once that blood starts to travel, the oxygen concentration goes down because the blood leaves the lungs, it starts going down, oxygen pressure goes down, and it starts to naturally release some of that oxygen out into the tissues. Number 2 is something called the Bohr effect. This is really the effect of pH. And it turns out that as your pH of the blood starts going down, it becomes more acidic, which is basically an increase in the hydrogen ion concentration. Then that naturally causes hemoglobin to start unloading or unbinding to the oxygen. Remember that hemoglobin is a protein molecule, and proteins are usually sensitive to changes in pH, usually sensitive to changes in temperature. Well, because it is a protein, if it begins to experience changes in pH, if the pH starts to become lower, that means you have, it's more acidic, pH number is going down. That means there's more hydrogen ions there. That changes kind of that conformational shape of that hemoglobin molecule, and that helps it to start release some of the oxygen. Some of the oxygen becomes unbound or unloaded from the hemoglobin. Number 3 is an effect of carbon dioxide. Now this can really be looked at in one of 2 ways. Indirectly, carbon dioxide causes a change in the pH. So that's technically looking at the Bohr effect again. Indirectly, having more CO2, and I have an equation out here for you to kind of look at. This is water, H2O, plus CO2. That's the gas that you generate inside the body as a waste product, metabolic waste product. When that combines with water, it forms a carbonic acid. This is carbonated water, essentially. It forms carbonic acid that dissociates into bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. And remember, it's the hydrogen ions that help determine the pH. So the more CO2 that you have, the more hydrogen ions you have. The more hydrogen ions you have, the lower your pH. And so, again, this is kind of a picture of the Bohr effect as it's determined by your CO2 levels. Now, there is a direct effect of CO2 because it turns out if your CO2 levels go up, you have more CO2, that means that's going to kind of squeeze out and cause more oxygen to be unloaded from the hemoglobin molecule. So having more CO2 levels results in less binding of oxygen. But that's what you need because out in the tissues, remember, they're going through cell respiration out in the tissues. They're producing CO2 as a waste product. And by having more CO2 out in the tissues being generated, it lowers your pH. It also increases the CO2, so that means less binding of oxygen. But that's what you want because you want the oxygen to be released from the hemoglobin out from the tissues to go into the tissues where they need the oxygen. Number 4, this one's pretty easy. This is temperature. And again, hemoglobin, a protein, is affected by changes in pH and by changes in temperature. So as temperature increases, hemoglobin releases or unloads some of the oxygen. And you can think about this in terms of metabolism, because as our metabolism goes up, the amount of energy that we need goes up, and that usually has a increase in our overall core body temperature. And that means our oxygen level should also be, more oxygen should be released from the hemoglobin. Then number 5, there's a chemical called BPG. Now, this stands for 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate. It's just abbreviated BPG. This is a chemical that's produced by red blood cells, and it turns out that this particular chemical helps to also release hemoglobin, release the oxygen from hemoglobin. So the more the red blood cells are using energy and things, producing energy, the more BPG is released, and the more BPG there is, the more oxygen gets released or unloaded from the hemoglobin. So all 5 of these affect whether or not oxygen is bound to the hemoglobin or is it being released from the hemoglobin. Now let's look briefly at carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is the other gas that's transported, and it kind of shows you here 3 ways that carbon dioxide is transported in the blood. Now this is a little different than oxygen because the majority of carbon dioxide is actually part of this ion. Remember the equation that I showed you a few minutes ago with water combining with CO2. Once that happens, it forms carbonic acid, but that dissociates, that kind of splits apart into separate ions. And so one of those ions is HCO3 minus, that's bicarbonate ion. And that's how roughly 2/3, 70% or so of the carbon dioxide is actually transferred. It's transported in the bloodstream because that ion dissolves in the plasma, or it's also part of your red blood cells as well. Roughly 20% of the CO2 can bind to the hemoglobin and be transported, and then about 7 to 10% can actually be dissolved directly as a gas. Remember, Henry's law said that CO2 gas can actually be dissolved a little easier than, or much easier than oxygen does, and so 7 to 10% of CO2 is actually dissolved directly in the plasma. Now, carbon dioxide will diffuse from the tissue into the red blood cell. This is looking at tissue gas exchange. And so remember, take a look at the diagram. Here you have some kind of tissue cell, the mitochondria. We'll talk about the process of cellular respiration and energy production, but a byproduct of going through things like the citric acid cycle, electron transport, mainly the citric acid cycle, produces carbon dioxide. It's a metabolic waste product that you have to eventually get rid of. So that CO2 starts to build up in the tissue cells. And so you have a higher concentration here of the CO2. It starts pushing its way through that tissue membrane. So the CO2 diffuses from the cells into the blood and eventually into your red blood cell, your erythrocyte. Inside you have this chemical reaction that we mentioned a little bit ago. The CO2 combines with water. It forms carbonic acid and dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. And so that's kind of how CO2 is moving from the tissue into the bloodstream and how it's being transported. Now, one thing to note here is that this negative ion is created. This bicarbonate is a negative ion. It builds up in the red blood cell and then it moves out directly into the plasma. And so once it moves into the plasma, you have a kind of a difference of charges. So you have to balance out those charges. Otherwise, you're going to affect the osmotic pressure of your bloodstream. So to kind of keep all that in balance, you have to substitute another ion, another negative ion inside of the cell. You can't keep building up negative ions on the outside of the red blood cell. You have to have a balance here. And so to counteract that negative charge from building up, you have to have another negative ion in place, and that negative ion is chloride. Chloride then is going to be counteracted with the bicarbonate ion, and that's called the chloride shift. Once the red blood cells make its way to the air sac, the reverse process takes place. And so that reaction, remember, it's an equilibrium type reaction, so it's now going in reverse. And so that bicarbonate and that hydrogen ion that you have, they combine, they form the carbonic acid molecule. It then breaks down, it uses an enzyme, it then breaks down into water and carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide builds up here, so you'll have a higher pressure inside of that red blood cell, at least temporarily. But that higher pressure then pushes CO2 out of the blood, out through the tissues and into the air sac, where you'll exhale and get rid of that CO2 gas. Now, make sure you know these terms. Here's that same equation again. Water plus CO2 gives you the carbonic acid and bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ion. Make sure you know these terms: hyperventilation and hypoventilation. Hyper is, of course, more than, greater than, and so this is where you're breathing faster. Hyperventilation, you breathe faster, actually causes an increase in your blood pH, becomes more basic. And the reason is when you are ventilating too fast, too quickly, you actually get rid of CO2 more quickly. Some people think it's the reverse. Some people think that because you're breathing in fast, you're actually breathing in more CO2. But remember, CO2 levels that you're actually breathing in are less, much less than 1%. So you're not breathing in a lot of CO2. So by hyperventilating, you're breathing out too much CO2 too quickly. And if that happens, then that actually causes your pH levels to go up. It becomes more alkaline or more basic. This explains why the common remedy for hyperventilation is to breathe into a paper bag. It's not that you're trying to just exhale into the paper bag. What you really want to do is to inhale your CO2 that's escaping too quickly. Otherwise, you're going to have a problem with alkalosis. And so you want to capture your CO2 gas in a bag and then introduce that back into the body. Now, hypoventilation, this is lower ventilation rate than that is normal. And this is going to cause a decrease in blood pH. And that's because you're not exhaling out fast enough. You're not getting rid of the CO2 out of the body like you need to. The CO2 levels start to increase inside the body. If they increase, you'll end up having more carbonic acid, and that has more hydrogen ions produced. So hypoventilation causes a decrease in blood pH, and that's more acidic. Now, the last couple of sections we'll look at looks at controlling ventilation, and part of ventilation is under control by the nervous system, of course, mainly in the brainstem, where you have what's called the medullary respiratory center. It's part of the medulla oblongata. That's the medullary part, and this is what is sending signals to your muscles, to your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles between the ribs, to get them to contract and to relax in order to inhale and exhale. However, the cerebrum can control and override some of this, and so there's just a vocabulary word here for you: apnea, the cessation of breathing. You can override, your cerebrum can override what's taking place in the brainstem. In other words, you can hold your breath, and so that's a way that the cerebrum can voluntarily control your breathing. However, if you hold your breath long enough, then the CO2 levels, they rise very, very quickly, and that causes you to briefly go into an acid type condition, and then usually your medulla oblongata, your brainstem, kind of kicks back in and causes you to breathe again. Things that help to chemically control ventilation. Your body's always trying to monitor different things, and so you have chemoreceptors that are specialized nerve cells or neurons that are trying to monitor different chemicals in the body, mainly pH levels, CO2 levels, and oxygen levels. So we've kind of mentioned the pH levels already. It's monitoring that hydrogen ion concentration. It's monitoring the CO2 levels and monitoring oxygen levels to try to make changes if these increase or decrease. And we kind of mentioned pH already. Increased CO2 levels causes a lower pH, and usually that stimulates the medulla section, the respiratory centers, and the brainstem to kind of make you have a faster breathing rate. And it also tries to get you to breathe a little deeper as well. So usually people that are in an acidosis type condition, their CO2 levels are going up. Usually they have a faster respiration rate. Carbon dioxide, effect of carbon dioxide, small increases in CO2 levels usually have a big effect. And so these are just a couple of vocab words here for you. Hypercapnia, hypocapnia. Hypercapnia is just higher levels of CO2. Hypocapnia is low levels of CO2 in the body.